You are listening to the GodArchy podcast, where we shove a crowbar between state and church. This is the spot where Christian faith intersects with libertarian anarchism and voluntaryism. I'm your host, Mike Meharry. This episode is history. Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the GodArchy podcast. As always, I very much appreciate the fact that you've taken a little bit of time out of your day to listen to the show. Today, we're going to be talking to CJ Killmer. Now, CJ is the host of the Dangerous History podcast, and I first ran across this podcast, years ago, and was immediately sucked into it. CJ does a fantastic job of teaching history in a way that you're not going to get from your typical mainstream history sources. And the reason for this is CJ is a radical libertarian, as am I. And so I think the best way to sum it up is that so often when we are learning history, reading history, the people teaching it are pulling for a team, whether it's Team USA or, there's always some team that the historian, that's kind of where their perspective lies. And CJ doesn't have a team. So I think it creates a more balanced approach to the way he looks at history. And like I said, his podcast is outstanding. He does a lot of research. He puts a lot of work into what he's doing. So I highly recommend, obviously, listening to his show, adding it to your podcast list. And I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation, as is the case with most GodArchy conversations. You just never know where it's going to go. And I think one of the most interesting parts of my chat with CJ is when we got into talking about human nature and, does human nature change? And how does that view of human nature kind of color how we look at history and how we look at current events and things moving forward? So I think you're going to enjoy the interview. Before we get into it, I do want to remind you that there are various ways you can support this show. And I very much appreciate the support that folks give. The first thing that you can do, and probably the most vital thing you can do, is share episodes, share GodArchy posts. Let people know that we're out there. As I've said over in the last couple episodes, social media algorithms don't really like GodArchy all that much. So the only way to overcome that is to put it out there, share it on your own social media channels, let people know what we're doing. And if you would just do that one thing, I'd really appreciate it. You can also avoid those algorithms and just sign up for the GodArchy email list. You can do that over at godarchy.org. And, that's one way. You don't have to worry about finding it on social media. Every week, I will send you an email. I will give you links to the latest articles, to the latest podcast episodes, and so you can keep up with this that way. And then if you want to support the GodArchy podcast with your hard-earned dollars, that also is very much appreciated. I recently abandoned the Patreon platform and just created my own platform through my website. If you go to godarchy.org, you'll see a link for Support GodArchy. If you click that, you can go through and support us on a monthly basis. If you do, you will have access to secret, special, awesome bonus content, specifically our mudslide rounds, where we talk a little bit more with our interview guests and do some fun stuff with them. So you can do that. Also, if you want to just make a one-time donation, you can do that through PayPal. There's a link on godarchy.org for PayPal. And also, I will be happy to accept donations in crypto, Ethereum or Bitcoin. And again, godarchy.org, you'll find places to do that. Really appreciate the support. One of the things I think makes this supporting listeners program, if you will, special, is that I'm going to pass on some of that support to other folks, people who are in need, organizations that we believe in. It's kind of a way to build community and support community and kind of do this voluntaryism thing that we're talking about. So again, you can check that out over at GodArchy.org, and I will definitely appreciate your support. So that's all the business. Let's get into this conversation with my friend, CJ Killmer. CJ Killmer, welcome to the GodArchy podcast. Thanks so much for taking a little time out of your day to come on the show.
Sure thing, Mike. Thanks for inviting me.
So we're going to talk a little bit about history because that's what you do. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how much government sucks because that's what we do on this show. So that should be
Sounds
fun.
Good.
Yeah. But let's start just a little bit. Give us your background. People know that you are the host of the Dangerous History podcast, which I've already given rave reviews to. But tell us a little bit about CJ Killmer.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm a born and raised Florida man. I was actually born all the way down in Miami, which is the Florida of Florida.
Right.
And eventually I went on to get a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in history. And for a variety of reasons, some of them kind of personal and familial, some of them sort of disillusionment with academia. I decided not to go on to a PhD, even though that was my original plan when I went to graduate school. And, it wasn't that I didn't do well. I got almost all A's in graduate school, and the professors that I worked with, were generally pretty positive on me. And I was even sort of like preemptively pre-accepted into the history PhD program at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, which is where I got my master's degree. They said, when I did my master's degree oral exams, they basically said like, oh yeah, you're kind of like a walk-on. If you want to, just walk right into a PhD program here, like, yeah, there's, but for a variety of reasons, I decided not to do it. And then what I ended up doing, I taught as an adjunct because most colleges and universities these days, you can't get a full-time teaching position unless you have the PhD. It's
right.
Academia, for those who don't know, is very rigidly credentialist in a way that a lot of private sector jobs are not, right? There's a lot of private sector jobs where even if you're missing some formal credential, if you can provide evidence that you can do a job, they'll often, kind of bend the requirements. But in academia, it's very rigid. And so I adjuncted, which they'll let you adjunct with just a master's degree at a lot of places, which means, you get crap for pay and zero benefits. And I adjuncted for a year at two colleges simultaneously. I was doing almost a full-time teaching load, but getting way less than full-time pay and no benefits. And then I got a gig, about the best you can do with just a master's in most fields with teaching is you can potentially get a full-time gig at a community college, which is what I ended up eventually getting here in North Florida. And so I taught full-time there for 15 years. And first few years, I liked it, even though I was super busy and desperately just trying to keep my head above water.
Right.
But I gradually started to get disillusioned with it for a variety of reasons. And so all the way back in 2014, just a little over 8 years ago, I started the Dangerous History podcast initially as just sort of like an outlet or a side project. And it was, I had already accumulated in all my time in graduate school, all my time. I've been interested in history and reading big serious history books since I was like 13, 14 years old.
Right.
And between that, my time in college as a student, and then my time teaching and continuing to research for cool stuff to share with my students, I had accumulated all kinds of interesting stuff that most people have no idea about as far as history goes. And I decided to start the Dangerous History podcast as just sort of like an outlet for me to be able to really, I shared a lot of pretty radical kind of libertarian revisionist sorts of stuff with my students from pretty early on in my teaching career. But, I wanted to basically be able to do whatever the hell I wanted to do and to have absolutely no restrictions of any sort.
Right.
And be able to just delve into things in a way when I'm teaching an entire like 200 years on U.S. history in one semester, I could share a few minutes on COINTELPRO, or I can share a few minutes on MK Ultra or some other thing like that.
Right.
But I was thinking, wouldn't it be cool if I could just like talk about something like COINTELPRO for an hour?
Yeah.
So anyway, started the Nature's History podcast with like zero budget, almost no know-how. I basically learned how to podcast and do audio and editing and everything like that on the fly. And sort of like, I think it's the Ray Bradbury quote, jump out the window and build your parachute on the way down. That's kind of what I was doing. And so, gradually I improved my quality. I learned how to do better audio. I learned how to do better just as far as like presenting solo podcasts, because it's a different, I'm used to speaking to a classroom full of students. And then now I'm speaking to an empty room and a microphone
it's
when I'm doing my solo episodes. Yeah. So I had to get used to that, get comfortable with that, figure out how to do it in a way that sounded good on a podcast. But I gradually from zero built up a following and, eventually became a fairly minor internet libertarian celebrity and, started to occasionally get invited to speak at cool events and whatever like that. And then finally this summer, I decided I just absolutely couldn't bring myself to return to my teaching day job in August. And I finally figured out a way. I felt for years like I was caught in a catch-22. Once my podcast started to make me a little money and all that, I was like, wow, I could potentially build this into something that could be, a career. But I was having a difficult time for the last several years, sort of getting the, I forget what they call it in like the space exploration realm, the breakaway velocity or whatever it's called. Yeah. Where like you need that one oomph, with the extra rocket boosters and whatever, just to break free of your planet's gravity enough that you can then be out in space and then it's easy going.
Right.
So I finally, and I'm kind of kicking myself that I was dumb enough that it didn't occur to me, earlier. But I finally said, what about a one-time crowdfunding campaign, because I was making okay money monthly from things like Patreon and so forth. But, my pay at my day job was never good, but it was steady. Right. And the benefits were pretty good by current American standards. So, not great, but good relatively. And so it was a matter of, well, how can I get to where I can walk away and not have my family immediately get homeless and have no health care and whatever.
Yes.
So yeah, I did I went the Indiegogo route, and my initial goal was $12,000. I had only a few weeks to do it in order to give my employer proper notice before school started back up. And, I had no idea. And before the original deadline I set was reached, I had long since blasted through the $12,000. And currently, because Indiegogo allows me and allows everybody else to, if your crowdfunding campaign gets fully funded prior to its deadline, you can continue to run it for, I think, a month after the original deadline. So I decided to do that, and people continued to throw in money. And so last I checked, I'm just a smidge below $21,000 out of an original goal of $12,000. So that gave me the little cushion I needed to resign from the job I'd been at for 15 years. And aside from the encouragement, right, that in a few weeks, a whole bunch of people from around the world who like what I do enough to want to get more of it from me,
right,
we're willing to pony up over $20,000 to help me do it. Yeah. Like that's really, aside from just financially giving me a little bit of a safety net for the next few months, that also provided me with like the moral encouragement that, wow, people really value what I do.
Yeah, that's cool. And that's hard because, you're talking into a microphone, like you said, in an empty room. You can see downloads, but I don't know. There's something about that actual feedback that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And, I made decent money, like I said, month to month from things like Patreon. So I knew there were people that, really valued what I did. But man, to have that in just a few weeks, I'd like to raise $12,000. And then in the course of like 3 or 4 weeks, I'm at $21,000. Yeah. Like that was just, almost brought me to tears in gratitude, honestly.
Yeah, I feel you. I totally can relate to that, trying to get that velocity. I think all entrepreneurs struggle with that at some point. Where I was in news. I was actually working at a TV station, and I kind of was in that. I remember being in that same place. It's like I'm about there, but I'm not quite. And then at that point, you're driving yourself crazy because you're basically doing 2 full-time jobs. And
yeah. I mean, I've been super busy the last 8 years. The last thing I am is a overnight success,
Right.
And I'm trying to remember. I think it was on. I forget what podcast it was on. I heard someone recently talking about. I think they called it the beta zone or something along those lines. And the idea is the worst place to be is in a situation where you're not super happy, you're not super optimal, you're not super fulfilled, but you're also not horrifically miserable.
Right.
And because then you get sort of trapped in that quiet desperation.
Yeah.
And, that's where I was for a long time with my job. And then, I've spoken about this publicly, but I've always been prone to depression. I've got it from multiple sides in my family tree, and had enough things go wrong in my childhood to activate all those epigenetic switches and everything like that. And the last 2.5 years had been definitely the hardest prolonged period of depression for me.
Yeah.
And much of it stemming from everything to do with the COVID regime and everything that came from it and how it affected my job and my day-to-day life. And it just ground me down. For the first 5-6 months of the COVID regime, I was a happy warrior. I was like, well, this kind of sucks, but
soldier on.
Yeah. And
of course, it was only 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks to flatten the curve,
Oh yeah, 2 weeks to flatten the curve became 2 years to flatten the world.
Exactly,
is how I put it. But yeah, it just ground me down by attrition, and got me very depressed. And the job was getting more and more depressive to me, not just because of the COVID stuff, but because of other changes and things happening. And then a series of unfortunate events happened to me this spring that really made me even more depressed. And so I guess my point is that as horrible as the last 2.5 years were for my mental health, I can now look back on it and ultimately be grateful that all of that happened to me, because all of that gave me the push that I needed. It pushed me from being stuck in that beta zone, that limbo zone of I'm not super happy and fulfilled at this job, but I also, I'm not uncomfortable enough to just, burn my bridges and walk away, to finally being like, that's it. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So, now I'm actually, I guess this happens to everybody. The whole, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger thing.
Right.
That you can turn suffering into something positive, assuming it doesn't kill you, and assuming that you make the decision to turn it into something positive.
Right, absolutely. It's kind of the whole spiritual idea of being, in the desert. You spend time in the desert before you can be in the promised land, and that kind of makes you appreciate that retrospect. What you've been through. And if you have to look back at everything and find no purpose in it, then that gets even more depressing. So,
yeah. It definitely made everything that much better when I finally said I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And cleaned out the classroom and office that I'd occupied for 15 years, which was a hell of a job. It took me it took me 4 days actually to get everything cleaned out, and brought home the stuff I wanted to keep and threw out the stuff I wanted to throw out. Of course, the campus dumpster was like on the complete opposite side of
course it was.
A pretty sprawling campus. Yeah, it was like at least a half mile away, if not more, from
in August in Northeast Florida.
Yeah. I mean, it was a particularly hot week too. It was, the heat index was like 110 with the humidity factored in. And I had this little wheelie cart, I'm dragging just piles of hefty steel sacks across campus to throw them in the dumpster. But boy, was I happy. And I'll tell you, last week was the week that I would have been back at work, preparing for this week, which is the first week of classes there. And so last week was particularly joyful to me.
Yeah,
And I felt particularly grateful because I was like, wow, this is the week when I'd be going in and, sitting through all kinds of meetings that are completely pointless.
yes,
And, yeah. So yes, I'm a liberated human being now. Free
indeed.
range. So
you mentioned this kind of earlier on when you were talking that you were interested in history from a pretty young age. Kind of what got you into that as a 13, 14-year-old? I mean, most 13, 14-year-olds aren't reading history books. What kind of sparked that in you?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about why we get interested in the things we get interested in.
Yeah.
And I think that as with most things, it's ultimately a combination of nature and nurture. I don't think most things anyway, are 100% one or the other.
Yeah, agree.
And so in my case, I generally tend to just be a very curious person. I always want to figure out, how things work and how things got to be the way they are.
Right.
And somebody once said that when you're born, it's like you're born into the middle of a story that's been going on for countless thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so imagine there was a movie that's thousands of years long and you're suddenly just plopped into the middle of it. I mean, you'd be wondering, like, who's that guy? Why are those people doing those things? How do we get to this point? And so to me, history is like you're dropped into that situation and you're able to get access to the backstory.
Yeah.
To the prequels or whatever. And then once you have access to the prequels and you know what went down before you got into the theater, then you're able to understand better what's happening right now.
Right.
And so I think that was just the inherent internal thing I had as far as personality goes. But then there's also, the experience, the nurture side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, I went to Florida public schools, all the way up through 12th grade. And I know this might shock people, but most of the teachers I had were either, just kind of blah, mediocre, or downright terrible. Like
yes.
in some cases, and I don't just mean they were mean and whatever, although some of them were, but people that you could tell were not particularly expert or enthusiastic about the subject they were teaching.
Yeah.
I remember I had one marine biology teacher in high school, and I was so excited to take that class because I love fishing. I love snorkeling. I grew up in the water in Florida. I'm like, yeah, marine biology, this is gonna be great. And it was terrible, and I could tell pretty quickly that this guy knew less about marine biology than I did just from spending my childhood fishing.
Yeah.
But most of us who went to public school, we can remember the few really good teachers precisely because they were not the norm. They stood out. Like if all of your teachers were superb, it would be hard to be like, oh, Mr. So-and-so, Miss such and such, they were great. But through the luck of the draw, I just happened to have two of my best teachers were history teachers. I had a really great history teacher in middle school who did a really good job of making everything interesting. And then again, in high school, I had a really good history teacher who was excellent. And I don't know about the middle school history teacher that I liked, but I know for sure that the high school history teacher that I liked actually had a master's in history, not in education.
Oh, wow.
And so
that's unusual, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he actually also taught as an adjunct at the local community college at night too.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I could tell right off the bat, because he was my history teacher my last 2 years of high school. And I had very, mediocre to poor history teachers my first 2 years of high school. And I could tell right off the bat, like the first day of class, I was like, oh, this guy actually knows what he's talking about, because he could talk off the cuff in detail about stuff without looking at any notes.
Right.
He could go well beyond what was in the textbook and all that stuff. And he was good at communicating it. So, those two things just kind of nudged me to where I've always been a voracious reader. But by the time I was a teenager, in addition to reading tons of fiction, I was also reading history and political science and all these sorts of things. So, yeah, that's what got me into it. And then history, I'm one of the people who can say that studying history is actually what turned me into a libertarian.
I was actually going to ask that question. So,
yeah. And I'm surprised. Well, on one level, yes, and on one level, no. In a way, I'm surprised that more people who read a lot of history don't become libertarians or anarchists or whatever, because there's just, it's, especially when you're looking at like the political side of history and all that, it's a bunch of psychopaths,
Yes.
exploiting people and starting wars for their own personal benefit.
Right.
And I mean, just all these terrible things. And you would think that more people, if you read about that stuff long enough, you'd put two and two together and be like, oh yeah, authority in the political sense, coercive political authority is not a good thing and is at the very least something that you should be skeptical of. But on the other hand, I'm not surprised because as I'm sure you know, and probably most of your listeners know, a huge amount of what is done under the banner of history is ultimately court history. It's propaganda.
Exactly.
And, so yeah, if all you're reading is Doris Kearns Goodwin and Michael Beschloss and all these sorts of establishment approved people, of course, you're never going to draw lessons that are anti-authoritarian from history because they're going to tell you that, most of the presidents have been great guys.
Right. Our authoritarians are good authoritarians.
Yeah. There's a few bad apples, like, basically Nixon and Trump is about it as far
Right.
as those people are concerned.
Right.
But those handful of bad apples just serve to make all the others look so great,
Yeah.
like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. And now even George W. Bush is getting rehabilitated. I've seen.
I know.
I'm so excited to take his masterclass in leadership so I can learn how to start multiple wars based on lies and get hundreds of thousands of innocent people killed for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny, but not funny.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I guess my response is that I always have kind of a dark sense of humor about things. And so, yeah, I'm able to laugh at these sorts of things. But still, someone might see me laughing at George W. Bush's masterclass on leadership thing. Like if they're an anti-war person, be like, oh, how dare you joke about this? And it's like, well, that's how I deal with horrible things.
Right. Exactly. No, I totally get that. I'm right there with you. I mean, you almost have to laugh so as not to cry.
Yeah. It's cartoonish on
exactly.
some level. The degree to which this is, and it's so predictable too, that so many of the same establishment figures who, when Bush was actually president, were calling him a war criminal and calling him literally Hitler and whatever.
Yeah.
But now that they've decided that Trump is the worst thing ever in the world, now suddenly, just because Bush doesn't like Trump, now suddenly Bush is a great guy.
Right.
And we're supposed to overlook all of his crimes and everything like that.
Yeah. You hit on something that really drew me to your show initially. And I noticed it right off when I first started listening. And then I think it really became clear to me when you did the big series on the Civil War. And your approach is such that you're not getting the team narrative, if that makes sense. So like when you take the Civil War, people tend to approach it either from their kind of pro-North team or their kind of pro-South team, and you weren't pro any team. So it made it, I don't know, in a sense, I think much more objective. I maybe that's because you share my biases, but I think that's one of the great things about your show is that it is absent the regime talk and the propaganda and all of that stuff. In fact, you kind of lay that bare and expose it for what it is. And that's one of the reasons that I love pointing your show to people who are interested in the history who don't necessarily share our political philosophy, because they're going to get the political philosophy without it being hammered on their head, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And that is something that I've, especially after the first few years of doing the podcast, when I was just sort of figuring things out, that I did kind of shoot for is I shoot for what I call honest history. And I did a whole episode a couple years ago trying to explain sort of what I mean by this. And I don't have like maybe I'll figure one out someday, but I don't have like a simple little one sentence definition of honest history. But I try to sketch out some of the things I think about as far as what I'm shooting for. And, to me, a big part of honest history is that it is not propaganda.
Right.
And so I'm not trying to, it doesn't mean that I don't have my own ideological perspective and point of view on things.
Right.
And to me, to be honest, to be an honest historian is to not hide that and to not, delude yourself or your readers or listeners or whatever. So many people who are obviously on a team if they're doing history, will say, "Oh, no, this is totally objective," and you just look at it for a second and go, "No, you're obviously, yeah, exactly. Like you're obviously whatever a neocon, or you're obviously, a typical center left progressive establishment person. You obviously have biases." And to me, the more honest thing is to say, "Look, here's kind of my overall point of view. This is where I'm coming from," and then by acknowledging that to the person that's listening to you or reading you, and by acknowledging it to yourself, I think it's easier to then try to be fair.
Yeah.
Because I can say, look, I've got all these problems with Abraham Lincoln, and I'm no fan of the U.S. federal government. However, to use the Civil War example that you brought up, however, that doesn't mean that the Confederates were all good guys, and then I'm going to start waving a Confederate flag, because guess what? A lot of things that they did, aside from the whole, elephant in the room slavery issue, even if you just look at, how the Confederate government tried to run their war effort, it was very authoritarian. Because very often libertarians will get drawn into, they'll learn some of the truth about Lincoln and the Union side of the Civil War, and then they immediately fall to the opposite side of the dichotomy, and they suddenly become Confederate apologists.
Yeah, I think I was guilty of that at some point in my evolution.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely had some of that attitude. Even in the early days of my podcast, I was a little bit more sympathetic to the Confederacy than I became when I really delved into the research for that Civil War series, which was, I must have read 36 books for that thing. And
it's a fantastic series, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a project.
Yes, it was.
But, with the Confederacy, it's like people say, "Oh, the Union government did all these authoritarian things in the course of pursuing the war," and most of them, the Confederate government had also did over the course of the war as well.
Right.
And in some instances, at least, they went even further. So, as far as like taking over the economy and all that, the Confederacy went much further than the Union. They implemented something that some have characterized as war socialism.
Yeah.
And, they didn't do as much in terms of like cracking down on freedom of speech and whatever, but it wasn't so much because their leaders were against it as much as they didn't have the logistical capability, the organizational capability to do it.
Right.
I'm pretty sure Jeff Davis would have cracked down on free speech and free press at least as much as Lincoln did in the North if he had the capability to do it. So, I mean, that's, one of those things that people, they often, they learn the dark side of one side of a dichotomy, and they immediately start to become apologists and put the other side on a pedestal.
Right.
And my whole point is like, you don't have to pick a team.
Yeah.
And, I think about it where sometimes people will, in more recent cases, they'll see a person or an organization that clearly is a victim of the federal government.
Right.
And they immediately then flip it into, oh, they're a good guy. Like, there are people who go around basically trying to act like David Koresh was totally fine, and there's nothing at all, shady or weird or suspicious or dark about him and his organization. It's like, no, you can acknowledge those people were victims, and they certainly shouldn't have been treated the way they were, especially, the kids who were there and all that. I mean, it's horrific. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there's not something creepy about David Koresh and at least some of what he's alleged to have been doing. And, I don't know how much of it's true or how much of it's not, or, Randy Weaver or any of these people. It's like, they could be victims of an abusive federal government and also be people like I don't want to be, apologists for and buddies with.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. Your kind of approach and philosophy toward history is very similar to mine when it comes to journalism. So journalism is my background. And I always said, they talk about journalism being unbiased. I don't think that's possible because human beings are inherently biased. We're biased by all kinds of things, by our upbringing, our religious beliefs, our political, all kinds of things. But we can be objective, even if we're not unbiased. And part of that is recognizing your biases and working to overcome them. And the second thing is just seeking out both sides of whatever issue you're delving into, so you can be fair and objective, and yet still be biased and acknowledge that bias. And I think that's kind of what you're saying with history, and I think that's a important way to approach it.
Yeah. Another sort of instance of this that I've seen a lot is in regard to like current events or recent events with the U.S. government, where and this seems to be something that anti-war leftists are kind of particularly prone to, where they'll see the U.S. government doing something not great in the international realm to
Right.
some country, and instead of just stopping there and being like, "Look, this is wrong because of such and such," they'll then flip to the other side of the dichotomy and suddenly become apologists. And so
Right.
you'll have people who will point out the NATO complicity in provoking the Russian invasion of Ukraine,
Mhm.
and that's all fair. But then they'll go to the opposite extreme and start trying to paint Putin as like this great guy.
Yeah.
Or they'll do it with Venezuela. They'll look at the U.S. government doing bad things to Venezuela, and they'll go, instead of just saying like the U.S. government shouldn't be doing these things, they'll go all the way to, well, actually, the Venezuelan regime is great and it's a wonderful paragon of human rights and it's helping its people, and
Right.
or it's the same thing that happened back during the Vietnam War, where the anti-war movement could have done a lot better if it had stopped short of becoming apologists for Ho Chi Minh and just simply said, look, the U.S. shouldn't be involved. They shouldn't be doing all the things they're doing over there. That doesn't mean Ho Chi Minh's a good guy and his regime is great. It just means that, dumping napalm and white phosphorus and Agent Orange all over an entire country is not a good thing to be doing.
Right, exactly. I've seen this, I've seen this tendency in the libertarian anti-war movement as well. This propensity to kind of elevate other regimes and forget that, I mean, when you really boil it all down, a regime is a regime, they all share certain fundamental things, the foremost, the quest for power. And so, you can't let the other guy off the hook just because your guy's bad too. I think that's a very important thing to keep in our heads.
Yeah, I would not be particularly thrilled to, be living under Putin's regime.
Right.
I'm not going to try and pretend he's something other than, another political leader with all sorts of, negative characteristics and tendencies.
Right. So here's a question for you from a historical standpoint. You hear this idea that history repeats, or some people will say history rhymes. Do you kind of fall into either of those camps, or is that all BS?
No, I think there's some truth to it. And like a lot of things, I think you can take it too far or take it too literally.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely think there are repetitions of themes. And partly I think it has to do with like human nature. I always am hesitant to come down super hard on one side of a dichotomy. Like I was saying before with the nature versus nurture thing.
Right.
To me, anybody who's like, oh, whatever it is you're looking at, oh, it's 100% nature, or oh, it's 100% nurture.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of those seems plausible to me in most cases. There's a few rare things like a particular birth defect or genetic disease or whatever.
Right,
but, most things people are talking about as far as like personality traits or whatever. And the same thing when, is history, is it linear or is it cyclical? Well, it's kind of a bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing I would say as far as the question of human nature. Is there such a thing as human nature that is timeless? My answer would be, well, yes and no.
Yeah.
To me, it's pretty clear that a person today in a modern developed country is hugely different in terms of how they behave from a person from 500 years ago, let alone a person from 5,000 years ago.
Right.
Like, there's clearly going to be massive differences in the way that they respond to all sorts of things that's molded by their experience growing up in their environment. But I do think there are certain aspects of human nature that are kind of timeless. Now, they might manifest in different ways in different situations. Mm-hmm. But, things like the lust for power that some people are particularly prone to. Like, I don't think that's ever going to go away.
Yeah.
And, the fact that people will often tend to pursue their own interests, but give it the veneer of altruism or the public good or whatever. Mm-hmm. Those things I think are pretty timeless elements of human nature. The tendency of leaders to create wars for their own, their own purposes. The tendency of most people to go along with that when it happens.
Right.
A lot of these things don't ever seem to really go away. And so I definitely think there are cycles. I do think there is something to the idea of different civilizations and empires kind of go through different life cycles. I do think there's something to that. I might not take it quite as far in the literal direction as somebody like Oswald Spengler would,
Right.
but I think actually Carol Quigley in Tragedy and Hope does a pretty good job of sort of sketching out an idea of like cycles that civilizations go through.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely think there's a strong case to be made that the United States is currently in an imperial decline phase of its evolution.
It's funny you say that. My wife and I actually just had this conversation 2 nights ago.
Yeah. I mean, this has been on my mind for a while, but particularly the last few years. And I don't think there's any way to make sense of recent American history without understanding that a big part of what's going on is classic imperial decline.
Yeah.
And, you can compare it to lots of other empires that have come before. And I think this is a case where I think it illustrates the idea that history rhymes, where it's not the same. Mm-hmm. But for example, I think there are elements of the Roman Empire's decline that are clearly similar and parallel to America's. Mm-hmm. But I also think there are elements to the Soviet Union's decline that are similar and analogous to America's decline. And the same is true of almost any empire you can think of. Like I think, for example, there are even elements of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's decline that are similar to what America's going through right now. And, one of the things that you find that's a common feature of empires in decline that clearly characterizes America, particularly the last 20 years, is that empires in decline are very prone to actually going to war more. When an empire is kind of like up and coming and on the rise, very often you find they actually don't go to war all that often, and they don't go to war lightly, and they don't go to war stupidly. Yeah. They tend to kind of pick their battles and only go to war when they're pretty sure they're going to win and there's actually some upside. So there's something to be won.
Right.
And then empires in decline, it's the opposite. They go to war more frequently. They go to war over dumber reasons. And they go to war very often in cases where you look at it objectively and you go, there's no upside. Like even if you win, this isn't going to, what are you going to win? You're not going to win anything tangible.
Right.
And I think this is one of those human nature things that I do think that people who pursue political power are different from us regular folks in the cheap seats. Like I think psychologically they're different.
I think most of them are sociopaths.
Oh yeah. I think most of them are either sociopaths or psychopaths, which very similar, and most of them also probably have some degree of legit narcissism as well.
Yeah.
And, this then can lead to delusions of grandeur and all sorts of crazy things. And yeah, I think that's something that, when I really started to look into the psychological literature about like what psychopathy and sociopathy really are and how these people really work, it was like it lit up a light, so where I could see things I couldn't see before in history.
Yeah.
To just realize like, no, and people tend to assume that other people are the same as them. And this makes most people who are not devoid of conscience and all that potential victims and suckers for people who are, because you're getting conned by a con man, sociopath, and you don't realize this person, you look at what he's doing and you think, oh, he can't just be, ripping me off without a conscience. Nobody would do that. It's like, no, some people are wired that way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think those people are disproportionately likely to be drawn to political power, to pursue it. And I think those people are disproportionately likely to be successful in climbing political hierarchies of power. And so this to me is why leaders tend to sort of be the same types of people throughout history and also across different countries. Every now and then through some freak accident or whatever, a person who's not a complete monster ends up in a high position of political power. It does happen, but it's not the norm. It's not the default setting. And so this to me is part of why you see people ruling empires in decline tend to behave in similar ways, because they're similar people psychologically, whether it's the late Roman emperors or whether it's the late American imperial presidents. They're similar psychologically, and they're responding to similar analogous situations with similar actions. And so, yeah, you see they lash out stupidly in wars, And I think very often what's happening is that leaders of empires in decline don't want to admit their empires in decline because they want to still think of themselves as great rulers over great empires.
Right.
And so on some level, they kind of delude themselves into thinking, well, if I just, pick a fight with one of my neighbors and, kick the crap out of them, I'll turn my empire's decline around and I'll make my empire great again, so to speak.
Right.
And very often, in fact, almost all the time, I think, when the people running empires in decline do this, it has the opposite effect of what they intend and what they think.
Right.
They think it's going to they think it's going to turn around their empire's decline, and it actually speeds it up. And I think that's what you see, for example, if you look at the beginning of World War I, when the Austrian Empire was so eager to go to war against Serbia.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, we're just going to, beat the crap out of Serbia. And that'll be that. And we'll flex our muscles and prove to the rest of the world we're still a great power. And rumors of our decline have been grossly exaggerated.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of turning around Austria's decline as a great power, their decision to essentially, launch World War I sped it up.
Yeah.
And I look at a lot of America's wars recently, and, none of them have yet ended in quite as dramatic of a disaster as what happened to the Austrian Empire due to World War I. But man, you look at like the Afghanistan war or something like that. It's like, what upside was there other than to military contractors who got rich?
Yeah.
Like, other than that, what was the upside to anybody,
Zero.
either American or Afghan? It just makes no sense.
Right.
What's the upside right now to deliberately provoking the heck out of China and Russia, both nuclear armed countries, by the way?
Right.
There's no upside. What does the United States stand to win by the war in Ukraine, regardless of how it ultimately turns out?
Right.
There's no upside other than to special interests who profit from it, but that's about it.
Right. And on the flip side, there's a great cost. You start with the financial cost. I wish I could remember off the top of my head. I wrote an article for the 10th Amendment Center about a year ago that chronicled the cost just in monetary terms of Afghanistan and the quote unquote war on terror. It's trillions and trillions of dollars. And then you have the social costs that go along with this perpetual state of war where it ends up feeding this kind of domestic police state and kind of as James Madison put it, a degeneracy of morals that kind of comes with, constantly killing people all over the planet. And so it's not just the fact that it's not gaining you anything, it's costing you a great deal in undermining that quote unquote greatness even further.
Yeah. War is corrosive to a society on like a civilization level. Mm-hmm. It has a decivilizing effect. And, not to say that there might not be rare circumstances where like you have no choice. It actually is truly defensive. Like the Mongols are steamrolling towards your settlement and there's nothing you can do other than try and fight back.
Right.
But those are actually relatively rare across the sweep of history. Most wars aren't that simple and clear cut and clearly defensive on the part of one side. Even if you found yourself in a situation where you legitimately had no choice but to fight to defend yourself, you would still want it to be as quick and over with as quickly as possible. Because the longer it drags on, like you were saying, the more it's going to degrade your people. I mean, you can't engage in something like war for very long without it just completely corroding your basic morals and damaging you psychologically. And there's evidence of this in the modern world, and there's even kind of anecdotal evidence of this in the ancient world. That you could even see it if you read the Iliad. You can see it being sort of portrayed there. Right. That the longer that war drags on, the more everybody starts to kind of set aside the ethics and morals and codes of honor that they used to adhere to before it. And, you see it, I talked about it in one of my Civil War episodes, that in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was a big uptick in things like substance addiction. Right. And they had to build a whole bunch of new sanitariums and asylums to deal with damaged veterans. And there's evidence in more recent wars, that in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, there's noticeable increases in all sorts of social dysfunctions and whatever. So, yeah, and I'm sure you're, in speaking to you, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this. I'm sure you're already, very well aware of this, but that it's really kind of disturbing how much sort of like social conservatives, very often self-professed self-professed Christians will be in our time rabidly pro-war.
Yeah.
And then you go like, wait a minute, all the wholesome family values and everything that you claim to stand for are damaged horrifically by war.
Mm-hmm.
And damaged tremendously by perpetual war. And so, just think about, and I'm sure you've heard, Tom Woods often brings this up, I think. I think he kind of takes pride in causing Pat Buchanan even to kind of, second guess himself a little bit on the Vietnam War, where he says, don't you think that the Vietnam War ultimately had a negative effect from a social conservative kind of standpoint, that the country would have been better off from a social conservative standpoint if it had stayed out of Vietnam? Because you wouldn't have gotten all the crazy, political upheaval and cultural upheaval and revolutionary and quasi-revolutionary stuff that the war ultimately, triggered.
Right. Yeah. And I always look at it, or try to, and this was something that I kind of had to do as I was making my kind of political evolution, because I was a neocon, I'm ashamed to say. And, kind of looking beyond just my own borders and recognizing the humanity of Iraqi children and, Afghan men and women, that those people are people too, and they have families, and by and large, they just want to go on with their lives just like I do. And you insert these governments into the equation, and all of a sudden you're taught to hate these people that you really have no reason to hate. And it's really perverse when you really stop and think about it. And I think that's the problem. People don't stop and think about it.
Yeah, and the propaganda, that's something I've been delving into a lot lately, and that I've been studying for like 20 years, is the theory and the historical practice of propaganda.
Yeah.
Modern propaganda is as old as human society, but modern propaganda really comes out of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that propaganda always tries to do is to either just sort of ignore, memory hole, black out, pretend don't exist enemy non-combatants and civilians, or if they can't be just simply ignored, to then one way or another try and portray them as complicit in their government's crimes, real or imagined.
Right.
And it's kind of silly, because especially in a case where they're telling the truth, that the government that you're fighting is authoritarian dictatorship. It's like, well, if that's the case, then there's even more reason to not want to attack their civilians, because their civilians aren't even even in the fake kabuki dance sense of modern democracy. Like, what's the point? Okay, Nazi Germany is a dictatorship. All right, I'm not going to argue with you on that. But then, why does it make sense to firebomb civilians, including women and children?
Right.
If you've just told me in the last propaganda reel that the Hitler regime is a dictatorship that doesn't care about its people, well, then what are you doing by firebombing non-combatants?
Right. Or,
nuking Hiroshima or firebombing Tokyo? Like, you just told me the Japanese government, one of the reasons they're bad is they don't care about their people. This then turns into a situation where it's like, you've got a bad guy holding a bunch of hostages, and your response is to start killing the hostages, start sniping the hostages in the name of trying to bring down the bad guy who's holding them hostage. It makes no sense.
Yeah.
And, this is something I just, about a month ago, maybe a little over, I did a giant episode, part one of what's going to be probably a 4-part series about World War I propaganda in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I talked about was the way that this first episode, for those who haven't, who aren't familiar with it, who haven't listened to my podcast, the first episode was all about the British propaganda operations in the U.S. for almost 3 years, that was designed and ultimately contributed to pulling America into the war on their side.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that the British made sure to do with their control of information going across the Atlantic was to make it so that Americans were pretty much clueless as to the fact that the British had actually broken the rules of naval warfare before the Germans did.
Right.
The Americans would hear all about the German U-boats, doing things they weren't supposed to do, which is real. They were breaking the laws of the rules of war at the time, as far as when they would attack cargo vessels and how they would go about doing it and whatever. They were breaking various pre-existing rules.
Right.
But the British started breaking the rules of naval warfare first. by the way they instituted their blockade against Germany, how they carried it out. They were breaking all the previous rules first. And only after almost a year of the British doing that did the Germans respond with their U-boat campaign, which also broke some of the naval rules of war.
Right.
And so Americans it's a classic lie by omission. Americans were getting told all about the bad things the Germans were doing, but they weren't hearing little or anything about the bad things the British were doing. And in particular, over the course of the war, and I would bet you that there's not one American in 1,000 that knows about this today. Over the course of the war, the illegal British starvation blockade against Germany, which kept out everything, including food and medicine, is believed to have killed minimum 500,000 or 600,000 civilians, and very likely much more than that. We don't know for sure. And how many Americans, either during World War I or ever since, have any idea that German women and children and elderly people were starving to death for 4 years. And, were dying of diseases they otherwise would have gotten over, but they were so malnourished. And that the British kept up the starvation blockade even after the armistice was signed. They kept it up until the final treaty was finalized. They continued to starve German women and children and elderly people. And I even mentioned in that episode, there were some documents uncovered not too long ago that were records of, I think, German schools in the aftermath of World War I. And German schools back then, typical German fashion, they're very meticulous about record keeping and all that.
Right.
They kept detailed records about students as far as their height and weight and things like this. And for years after World War I was over, German kids in many schools were smaller than was the norm. They were shorter and lighter. They were malnourished for years. And as many people may know, if you don't get enough nutrition when you're a child, that can permanently stunt your growth to where even if you do eventually get good food and whatever, you're not going to be as big and tall and healthy as you would have been otherwise. So, that's the legacy of the British, and they're the good guys that we needed to bail out, And again, to me, the proper approach isn't to go, well, that must mean the Kaiser's great and the Germans are the good guys. No, I end up in the same place I did with the Civil War, where it's neither side is good. So, the fact that I'm going against the side that we're generally propagandized to sympathize with, doesn't mean I have to, and doesn't mean that I am then going to suddenly be oh yeah, the Kaiser was great and the German government was awesome during World War I. It's no, they were bad too. And therefore, to me, the only rational and ethical thing for the United States would have been to stay out of it.
Stay out, yeah. One of the things that I found fascinating, but I'm about 2/3 through that episode, and you talked about how one of the very first operations that the British did was to cut the transatlantic cable lines so that all of the information that was flowing into North America was basically going through Britain. So nobody even got a chance to hear the German side of things because that communication was effectively cut off, which goes to show just how powerful, being able to control that narrative is, or to basically eliminate part of the narrative.
Yeah, and the British, they were dominant around the world in telegraph cables even before the war. Just because they had such a huge global empire. And, obviously, if you have an empire, it's useful to be able to communicate quickly across it. And so then they were able to knock out the German cables that went to North America and then use their naval dominance to protect their own cables while preventing the German cables from ever being repaired.
Right.
And this created what I refer to as narrative hegemony, where, little bits and pieces of things from Germany would get to America one way or the other, but it was just dominated by the British approved thing. And so, even American journalists who were operating in Europe during the period of American neutrality, if they were transmitting their stories back to New York or wherever they were from, it would have to go through British telegraph cables in most cases. And guess what? The British government was monitoring those and censoring those, and they're not going to let you in most cases. If let's say, and a lot of American journalists were already pro-British and were already basically being propagandists,
right?
But there were some honest journalists who were trying to send back accurate, fair information of what was really going on the ground in Europe, and very often they wouldn't be able to because the British just wouldn't, allow their messages to go through on their telegraph cables, and it's very analogous, in my opinion, to the way that the West, the NATO world, whatever, has dealt with the information coming out about the war in Ukraine, where you're clearly only getting one side, and it's being presented to you as the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but it is absolutely not. And what exactly the truth of everything is as far as on the ground in Ukraine, I don't claim to know. But I do know that governments have every incentive in the world to lie and to manipulate during wartime. Like they always have an incentive to lie and manipulate and propagandize, but during wartime it goes through the roof.
Yeah, hyperdrive.
And so I don't accept at face value automatically anything that comes from anybody affiliated with the Ukraine government or with, the American government or with the American corporate press, which might as well just be considered part of the American government at this point. Yeah. And, or the American government. And for that matter, I don't automatically accept what the Russians are saying because they also have incentives to lie when it's to their advantage to do so, to suppress facts when it's to their advantage to do so, to try and manipulate what people perceive. But you look at like how quick every single Russian news service and information outlet was just completely shut down throughout the West. And it's like, well, I'm sure they'd be putting out propaganda of their side, but now you're just getting Ukrainian and NATO propaganda.
Right.
And that's not a good solution.
Right.
And I mean, it was really ridiculous too, that where, even people who had previously worked on RT, who were American, who were in no way really a Putin apologists, got like shut down off of YouTube. Like people like Chris Hedges, for example.
Yeah.
Like, okay. He had a show on RT. He's obviously not a pro-Putin propagandist or whatever.
Right.
The idea that he should be like blacklisted from everything simply because he had a show that happened to be on RT, like he clearly was his own independent guy.
Right.
That was really disturbing. At the start of the Ukraine war, that, and then also the way they tried to like demonize Russian culture and the entire Russian people, where it's like, what was it near the beginning of the Ukraine war where they, whoever is in charge of it decided that like Russian athletes couldn't participate in the Special Olympics that year.
Yeah.
It's like,
yes.
Okay, good. Some handicapped Russian kids are no longer allowed to do the thing because of something Putin did. Oh, and again, you just finished telling me Putin's a dictator, doesn't care what his people think.
Right.
So you're punishing a handicapped kid from not being able to be in the Special Olympics because of what his government did, and his government supposedly doesn't even care what he thinks anyway. Or when you heard about like, libraries throwing out all of their Russian literature. It's like, really? You're throwing out Tolstoy?
Right. Dostoevsky?
Yeah. Let's throw out the literature of a Christian pacifist anarchist in the name of opposing Putin's war. Like it makes no rational sense whatsoever. And again, eerily similar, back to this idea of historical, rhyming, eerily similar to what happened in this country, which I'll be covering later in that series about World War propaganda, to what happened in this country as far as demonizing all things German. Like not just, the Kaiser and his government are bad, but the German people are evil, German books getting burned.
Right. Don't eat sauerkraut.
Yeah. Let's call it Liberty Cabbage, because that'll help win the war. And a lot of that got really ugly. A lot of that was what I would call like bottom up enforcement or horizontal enforcement, where a lot of the worst excesses of that stuff was not being done by the government directly in the US. It was being done by private citizens and private, vigilante organizations and things like this.
Well,
but some of it got really ugly where, people in a few cases were killed. Right. And in many more cases were like severely beaten and tortured and whatever for things like saying good morning to your neighbor in German. Right. Yeah. And this is at a time where the German immigrant population in the United States in a lot of cities was huge.
Right.
And, there was at least one case where a Lutheran minister was performing the last rites for an elderly dying woman. And because she was a German immigrant, he did the prayer in German.
Right.
And some super patriot, types overheard this and basically, I don't think they killed him, but they like severely beat this Lutheran minister for saying those evil German kraut words. So
we saw that similar kind of dynamic, in more recent years with Muslims.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And, I think the government did a little bit better of a job of at least trying in some cases to right wrongs where they occurred. It's still, they probably could have and should have done more, but man, when you look back at World War I, it's even worse, where people would just be completely let off the hook for horrific acts of violence.
Right. Or even encouraged.
Yeah. The attitude of the courts very often, even where convictions did occur, was sort of like, well, boys will be boys, and it is a war, and if these guys who practically lynched somebody for saying good morning in German, if they're guilty of anything, it's of loving America too much.
Right.
And in a war like this, is that something we really want to punish them for? So they get like a slap on the wrist or whatever if they even got convicted at all, which a lot of the times a propagandized jury would just let them off the hook even for brutalizing somebody.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about this forever. I want to be respectful of your time, so we're going to wind this down. I do want to ask. I do a little feature for my supporting listeners. I was going to call it a lightning round, but I call it a mudslide round because the first time I did it, it took 20 minutes. I don't think it'll take 20 minutes, but just a series of quick, fun questions. If you're willing to hang with me just for a few more minutes after we wrap up.
Yeah, sure.
But before we do that, I want you to let folks know where they can find the Dangerous History podcast and how they can subscribe and start listening and support what you're doing.
Sure. So the show is called the Dangerous History Podcast. And if you just put in dangeroushistorypodcast.com into your web browser, you'll get to my homepage. And then also, however you like to listen to podcasts, most people use some sort of podcatcher app. So whether it's Apple Podcasts, whether it's Spotify, whatever else is out there these days, if you just go in there and just search for Dangerous History Podcast, as far as I know, pretty much my feed is syndicated in all the major podcast venues. So you should be able to find it in whichever one you prefer. And feel free to go through my back catalog. A lot of it's evergreen stuff. It's one of the cool things about doing history.
Yep.
My Civil War series was like, I forget, 5 years ago or something like that. But it's still, worth listening to today.
My favorite series that you did was the when you did on the Everglades. As a fellow Florida man, I found out all of that extremely fascinating. So
that's one of the ones that has sort of like a cult following within my audience. And I
would be in the cult.
I do like to throw in some Florida history every now and then because I have studied it a lot and taught it in college. So another one on the Florida history vein that I did a long time ago, very early, and that now is behind my paywall with my earliest episodes, was on the Seminole Wars in the 1800s. And that's one I want to revisit in the future with longer episodes, with more detail, and of course with my much more improved audio and production quality versus back in 2014. So but anyway, Dangerous History Podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast, you should be able to find it. And if you like my work and want to help me out and get access to various bonuses and perks and whatever, I'm on Patreon, I'm on Subscribestar. In the future, I'll probably have some other venues for recurring monthly contributions and things. And then also my Indiegogo is still up for at least another week or so. So if anybody wants to throw in a one-time donation, if you just go to Indiegogo and search for Dangerous History Podcast, it should come up. And there's various perks and things you get there if you contribute, depending on how much.
I will pop all of those links into the show notes page so people can go straight there.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you for being on. Hang with me for a few minutes and we'll do the really fun questions for the elite GodArchy podcast listeners. But thank you again for taking the time. Really good conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, sure thing. My pleasure.
All right. There you go. History. Gosh, I so badly want to do the cheesy, that's the end of the podcast. It's history. So I'm not going to do that, even though I just kind of did. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode. Again, remember, you can support GodArchy. Go to our supporting listener page over at godarchy.org, and you'll be able to hear the mudslide round that I mentioned. In this one, we talk about snakes. That's a good one. So appreciate your support. Appreciate you listening to the show. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. And I will talk to you again in a couple of weeks. All right, it's time for the ending stuff. Again, thank you so much for listening to the show. Make sure you check out the website, GodArchy.org. You can sign up to our email list there. We're also on social media, on Facebook, at GodArchy.org. We're on the Twitters, at GodArchy. And you can also find us on MeWe. Just look for GodArchy. If you want to contact me, shoot me an email, info@GodArchy.org. And of course, you can support the show. Just go to GodArchy.org, hit the Support GodArchy button, follow the instructions. Again, we really value your listenership. That's all. There's no more. Just listen to the music.